want you to imagine that you are a high society intellectual in London. The year is 1704. You're sitting in a mahogany-lined drawing room. You read the Greek classics, you know your theology, and you think you have a pretty good grasp on how the entire universe operates. You got your powdered wig strapped on so tight it actively cutting the blood circulation to your last two functioning brain cells. You're sipping imported tea that costs more than the peasant's entire house, and you're absolutely suffocatingly bored. Then a man walks into the room. He looks European. He's a bit pale, maybe a bit scruffy, but he looks you dead in the eyes and tells you he's a native from a land you've only ever heard of in a fever dreams of sailors and rumors. The island of Formosa. He doesn't just tell you about it, he performs it. He speaks the language, a bizarre, aggressive series of clicks, grunts and guttural stops that sound like a cat walking across a harpsichord. He writes the alphabet for you, producing a collection of squiggles that look like a spider had a stroke on a piece of parchment. He describes his native religion, which apparently involves massive golden altars and a staggering industrial amount of child sacrifice. And because you are a sophisticated Londoner with a massive ego and a desperate, pathetic need to feel cultured and ahead of the curve, you don't just believe him, you make him a superstar. This is the story of George Psalmanazar, a man who proved that the most valuable thing you can sell to human beings isn't the truth. It's a lie so big, so detailed, and so incredibly exotic that they would feel like absolute idiots for questioning it. He didn't just sell a fake monument like Victor Lustig selling the Eiffel Tower, he sold the entire country that didn't exist. Welcome to the intellectual void of the 18th century. Grab a seat and maybe a translation dictionary for a language that was entirely made up in a damp basement in France. This is the epic deep dive into the greatest cultural forgery in human history. Now, who was George Psalmanazar? The short, terrifying answer is, we still don't know. Even in his own memoirs, written on his deathbed, when he had absolutely nothing left to lose but his reputation, he refused to reveal his real name. We know he was born somewhere in the south of France, probably around 1679. He was a brilliant kid. He was the 17th century equivalent of a gifted child burnout. The kind of kid who could fluently read and write Latin, while the other children in his village were still figuring out how not to choke on their own spit. But George had a massive problem. He was bored and he was incredibly broke. He realized very early on that being a poor, highly educated French student was a one-way ticket to a life of quiet, agonizing desperation. He was looking down the barrel of a lifetime of eating moldy bread and staring at stone monastery walls. So he decided to simply opt out of his own reality. He decided to become someone else. At first, he started small. He pretended to be an Irish pilgrim traveling to Rome. He stole a heavy cloak and a wooden staff from a local church, practiced a fake aggressive accent and hit the road, begging for alms. But Ireland was too close. People in France had actually seen Irishmen before, and apparently George didn't look enough like a potato farmer to pull on the con or for the long term. He kept getting caught. He realized he needed something more void adjacent. He needed an identity from a place so incredibly far away that absolutely no one in Europe could check his references. He needed a place that existed only as a vague, terrifying rumor on the edge of a map. He initially settled on Japan, but then he realized Japan was also a bit too known, thanks to the Dutch merchants who occasionally brought back stories of samurai and tea ceremonies. So he went for the ultimate undocumented blank state, Formosa. Today we call it Taiwan, but in the year 17,000 to a Londoner or a Frenchman, Formosa was as mysterious and inaccessible as the dark side of the moon. George spent months hiding in a Jesuit-run hostel, quietly listening to missionaries tell exaggerated stories about the Orient. He took notes like a madman, and then he started inventing. He didn't just make a backstory, he became a biological performance artist. He created an entire grammatical structure. He invented a dictionary, he designed a complex religious calendar. He wasn't just lying, he was world building. He was J.R.R. Tolkien to the 18th century fraud. Now George was a psychopath, but he was a brilliant psychopath. He knew that a lie needed texture. You can't just walk into a room and say you're from Formosa. You have to smell like it, you have to eat like it, you have to make the life physical. He began practicing these Formosan habits in public. He started eating raw meat, heavily seasoned with aggressive amounts of black pepper and cardamom, because he told everyone that Formosans didn't believe in using fire for cooking. It was a sacred element, and using it to cook a steak was a sin against the sun god. Now I want you to picture this guy in a crowded, filthy tavern in Germany, surrounded by hardened mercenaries and drunks. George pulls out a raw, bloody slab of beef, tosses a fistful of pepper on it, and starts tearing into it, like a feral wolf, all while whispering fake prayers to the ceiling in a language he invented that morning. People didn't back away in disgust. They leaned in. They were fascinated. "Look at the savage," they whispered. "He's so exotic." He was the first pioneer of the grotesque economy. He would sit in the middle of town square, cross-legged, staring directly into the sun until his eyes watered, muttering absolute gibberish. This bizarre street theater eventually caught the attention of a man named Alexander Innes. Innes was a chaplain in the British Army, but do not let the title fool you. Innes was a man whose moral compass was pointed directly at his own wallet. He was a professional opportunist, the kind of guy who would sell his own mother's soul for a promotion in a slightly larger parish. Innes sat down with George, listened to him click and grunt, and realized within about 10 minutes that George was complete, unadulterated fraud. But instead of exposing him, Innes saw a professional opportunity. Now let's review the unholy corporate merger that took place in this tavern. Innes looks at this kid eating raw beef and thinks to himself, "London is currently obsessed with converting heathens. The Anglican Church is desperate for a PR win. If I convert a real live Formosan, savage, and bring him to the Bishop of London, I will be a hero. I'll get a massive promotion, a fancy hat, and a lifetime pension." So Innes doesn't call the police. He essentially offers George a business contract. He tells him to drop the French accent, keep up the clicking noises, and come to London. They split the donations. It was the birth of a symbiotic parasitic relationship between a corrupt priest and a teenage con artist. Now Innes baptized George, officially renamed him George Psalmanazar, a name he literally just stole from the Assyrian king Shalmaneser in the Old Testament, and shipped him off to the London. The long con had officially moved into its second, highly profitable phase. Now, when George arrived in London in 1704, the city went into a state of collective high society psychosis. He was the ultimate exotic void. You have to understand the psychological landscape of London at the time. It was a city of coffee houses, endless gossip, and a desperate, suffocating desire for the new and the strange. The British Empire was expanding, and the elite wanted to feel like they were the masters of a vast, bizarre world. George was invited to the Royal Society. He was befriended by the Bishop of London, Henry Compton, who paraded George around as a living, breathing proof of the success of the Anglican mission. He was even sent to the Oxford University, the most prestigious academic institution on the planet, to teach his language to future missionaries who were supposedly going to travel to Formosa to convert the masses. Now imagine the scene at Oxford. You have these unstooged, brilliant professors, men who have spent 40 years meticulously studying Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. They were sitting in a mahogany-lined room with dust motes dancing in the light, taking furious notes as George explains that in Formosa the word for bread is and the word for God is Shaddai. He actually just stole a bunch of Hebrew words and mixed them with the gibberish he made up while he was bored in church and sold it to the smartest men in England. He taught them an entire grammar system, declinations, conjugations, all of it, and they believed it. Why? Because they wanted to believe it. Their egos demanded that they be the first scholars to master this new exotic tongue. Of course, people occasionally ask the obvious question, "George, old chap, why are you so white? You look like you've never seen the sun, let alone worshipped it on a tropical island. You're paler than the bishop's backside." but George didn't even blink. This is where the absolute genius of a counter-logic came in. He would let out a heavy, practiced sigh, look at the aristocrats and say, that is because the nobility on Formosa live in the massive subterranean underground palaces to avoid the scorching tropical heat. We are born in the shade, we live in the shade, and we only come out at night. We are as pale as the moon itself. Only the peasants, the commoners who work the fields are tanned. Do I look like a commoner to you? And the Londoners, they ate it up. They loved it. It made them feel like they had exclusive VIP access to an elite subterranean world. They invited him to massive dinner parties, where he would demand his meat raw. He would sit at the head of the table, surrounded by the finest minds in England, and tear into the raw, bloody steak while they watched in rapt, horrifying silence. He had filled the cultural void of London with a hallucination, and everyone was high on it. In 1704, George decided it was time to cash in on his fame. He published his magnum opus, a historical and geographical description of Formosa, an island subject to the Emperor of Japan. This book is a masterpiece of deception. It wasn't just a travelogue, it was a complete, unhinged world-building manual. He described the architecture, houses made of floating wood that could be moved during massive floods. He described the economy. Formosans used gold and silver coins with square holes in them. And they had absolutely no concept of debt, because anyone who owned money was simply eaten by their creditors. He described the diet. Snakes, cats and dogs were considered high-class delicacies, but only if they were beaten to death in a specific ritualistic way to tenderize the meat. But the epic part of the book, the thing that really caught the dark, morbid imagination of the British public, was the religion. George claimed that every single year, during the festival of the New Year, the Formosans had to sacrifice exactly 18,000 young boys to their god on a massive, towering golden altar. Let's just do the math on this for a second. Let's look at the logistical nightmare of George's theology. 18,000 boys every single year on an island that is roughly 240 miles long. If you are sacrificing 18,000 male children annually, your entire population would literally vanish into the golden altar in about 4 years. Even if every single female on the island was biologically operating like a rabbit, the math simply does not add up. But when scientists and skeptics pointed this out to George, he didn't panic. He just doubled down. He told them, the sun god has a very high metabolism. He likes the taste of innocence. It keeps the volcanoes from erupting. And besides, Formosan women are very productive. We also import kids from the mainland. It's supply chain issue. Are you really questioning the sun god? Now, despite the absolute mathematical impossibility of the text, the book was a massive bestseller. It was translated into French and German. George was no longer just a person, he was a primary source. He was cited in encyclopedias. He had successfully written global geography from a pub in London. But even in a world of powdered wigs, syphilis and extreme gullibility, there are sharks in the water. One of these sharks was Edmond Halley. Yes, the astronomer royal, the guy with the comet. Halley was a man who actually liked things like evidence, mathematics, and physical laws. He didn't care about exotic wives or subterranean palaces. Halley invited George to a meeting of the Royal Society. He didn't ask him about child sacrifice. He didn't ask him about raw meat or floating houses. He asked him about the stars. Halley looked at George and said, "Tell me, Mr. Psalmanazar, when the sun shines directly into the chimneys of the underground palaces in Formosa, what is the exact position in the sky during the summer solstice?" Now George, who knew as much about astronomy as a golden retriever knows about quantum physics, panicked. He gave an answer that was physically, astronomically impossible for an island located in the northern hemisphere, near the Tropic of Cancer. He described the sun's path in a way that would only happen if Formosa was located somewhere near the North Pole. Halley just smiled. He didn't yell. He didn't call him a liar. He just sat back, took a sip of his drink, and let the silence hang in the room. The scientific void had just been breached. Once Halley poked a hole in the astronomy, other skeptics started to emerge from the woodwork. Linguists pointed out that his alphabet looked suspiciously like a mix of Greek letters and Hebrew vowel points. Observers pointed out that his Formosan language seemed to magically change its grammar rules every time he got a little too much gin in his system. The aura of the state that George had built around himself was starting to smell like cheap French wine and desperation. By 1706, the Formosan fever had broken. The British public had moved on to the next shiny thing. People were starting to realize they had been paying for expensive dinners for a French guy with a creative imagination and a cast iron stomach for raw beef. George was quietly, politely dropped by his aristocratic friends. He wasn't invited to the Royal Society anymore. The bishop stopped calling. He didn't go to prison. There was no specific law against being a really good storyteller in the 1706, as long as you didn't directly steal from the crown. But he became something much worse. He became irrelevant. And for a man who lived entirely on attention and applause, irrelevance was worse than a death sentence. He spent the next few years as a ghostwriter working for absolute pennies in the gutters of London. He lived in Grub Street, the legendary filthy home of hack writers, failed poets, and desperate journalists. He became a heavy opium addict. He spent his nights in dark, smoke-filled dens, breathing in the opium void. He was a ghost of his own creation, wandering the exact same streets where he had once been treated like a god. He was living in a world of his own making, but the walls were starting to close in. He was a man who had sold the world an island, and now he couldn't even afford a warm room. But then something truly strange happened. Something that almost never happens in these stories of historical grifters. George Psalmanazar actually grew a conscience. It took about 30 years, a staggering amount of opium and a near-death illness, but he eventually converted for real. He became a devout, deeply penient Christian and a legitimate hard-working scholar. He stopped the clicking, he stopped eating raw meat, he taught himself actual Hebrew so well in fact that he became one of the leading theological experts in the country. He spent his days sitting quietly in the library, working on the Universal History, a massive multi-volume academic project. He was no longer a performer. He was a worker. He lived to be 84 years old, which is roughly double the life expectancy of a Londoner. But the most incredible part of his redemption is his friendship with Samuel Johnson. Johnson is the man who wrote the first comprehensive English dictionary. He was basically the intellectual king of London, a man famous for his brutal honesty and his absolute hatred for liars and frauds. And yet, Samuel Johnson loved George. Johnson once famously said that Psalmanazar was the best man he ever knew. Think about the profound, beautiful irony of that. The greatest liar in human history ended up becoming the moral compass for the greatest mind in London. George lived a life of extreme, punishing penitence, never forgiving himself for the vile forgery of his youth. He lived in a tiny, unheated room, eating plain bread and drinking water, desperately trying to balance the cosmic scales for the 18,000 imaginary boys he had sacrificed in his book. In 1763, George felt the end coming. He knew he couldn't take the lie to the grave. He wrote his memoirs, titled Memoirs of a commonly known by the name of George Psalmanazar, a reputed native of Formosa. In it, he confessed to absolutely everything. He described the void of his youth, the intoxicating thrill of the deception, and the crushing, suffocating weight of having to live a lie every single second of every single day. He explained how he had to stay in character even when he was alone in his room, just in case a maid or a landlord was watching him through a keyhole. He described the sheer mental exhaustion of having to invent the grammar of Formosan on the fly during dinner parties, and how he lived in constant paralyzing terror of being caught. But even in his final confession, he never revealed his real name. not because he wanted to stay in mystery, not because he wanted to leave a puzzle for historians. He kept his name a secret because he was so deeply ashamed of the pain and embarrassment he had caused his parents that he didn't want their family name permanently associated with this wild forgery. He died in a small room in Ironmonger Row, leaving behind a legacy that proved a simple, incredible, dark truth. If you give people a mirror that reflects their own prejudice, their own desires, and their own egos, they will never look at the man holding it. George Psalmanazar was the undisputed king of the intellectual world. He didn't just sell a landmark, he sold a reality. He showed us that our desire to be entertained and our desperate need to feel culturally superior to heathens are the absolute perfect tools for a con man. He was a man who lived two completely different lives, one as a monster of his own invention and one as a saint of his own redemption. Today we like to think we are smarter than the aristocrats at 1704. We have the internet, we have Google Earth, we have instant global fact-checking in our pockets. And yet we still fall for it every single day. Every time a crypto guru sells you a digital coin backed by absolutely nothing, or a lifestyle influencer promises you a secret exotic paradise that doesn't exist, George is somewhere in the shadows. He is smiling, sipping his raw meat-flavored soup, and watching us make the exact same mistakes. Next time someone offers you a VIP ticket to an exclusive exotic world that sounds just a little too perfect, check the math. And maybe ask them where the sun sits during the summer solstice. Stay strange, stay sharp. See ya.